I have written this book. It's called Illegal Wars, and I basically wanted to look at how does the United Nations work. You know, the United Nations is the World Peace Organization, and as a young student, I always hoped that the United Nations would establish peace tomorrow. So far, they were not successful. But if you look at the United Nations, if you study the history of the United Nations, you can learn a lot, because during the Second World War, 60 million people died. Okay, so that's the biggest catastrophe that we've ever had on the human planet. 60 million, that's the whole population of France. So imagine yourself traveling through Paris, everybody dead. Traveling to Marseille, everybody dead. Every small village you come through, Bordeaux, everybody dead. So that's the Second World War. It was a huge catastrophe. So the people at the end of the Second World War in 1945 said, we don't want that. We don't want that again, okay? We've had the experience. It's dreadful. It's awful. We don't want it anymore. So for the first time in human history, they signed a paper, which is called the UN Charter. And on that paper, they wrote that all nation states must refrain from using violence in international affairs. They're not allowed to bomb another country. They're not allowed to take tanks and invade another country. Okay, so that is the basis of international law as we know it today, that no country is allowed to bomb another country. And it's not, you know, just some flimsy idea of some peaceniks who hang out in the streets and say, no war. This is basically international law as we established it in 1945. And let me just, as a historian, add that this was the first time we've done this as a human family. Because during the last 2,000 years, we killed each other in many different ways. But in 1945, so that's 70 years ago, for the first time we said, let's not do it any longer. It's just ugly. Now, the problem is, and, you know, I went through many different countries in that book. The problem is that obviously we still have wars. Many of them are illegal. And the UN has a structure which is, let's say, not totally just. Because some countries are more powerful and others are less powerful in the United Nations. Let me explain this in more detail. We have 193 member states as of today in the United Nations. Of these 193, one is Germany, one is Switzerland, one is Austria, one is France, another one is New Zealand, a third one is Egypt, you know, the countries that you know. But only 5 out of the 193 are so-called permanent members of the UN Security Council. These are the United States, Great Britain, and France. So these are 3 NATO countries, plus China, plus Russia. Now, these 5 countries have the power to veto every and any resolution they wish to veto. What does that mean? It means that if they attack another country and the Security Council of the United Nations comes together, and it is the duty of the Security Council to watch for peaceful coexistence, then the Security Council, as a rule, would pass a resolution and say, hey, okay, this war is illegal. We said we're not going to do that anymore. So the country who started the war is a war criminal. Now, in a specific case, we can illustrate that this in fact worked. In August 1919, Saddam Hussein, president of Iraq, invaded Kuwait. Now, I already explained you can't do that. Okay, one country cannot invade another one. It's illegal. So the Security Council immediately came together and they passed a resolution, which basically is just a sheet of paper. And on that paper, they said, Saddam Hussein is a war criminal. That's perfectly correct. You know, that is exactly what they should do all the time. Because Saddam Hussein is indeed a war criminal. There was no right for him to invade Kuwait. So he was punished. You know, there was an international coalition, Desert Storm, everything. In 1991, he was pushed out of Kuwait, etc. And the status quo ante was restored. Now, compare this with 1956. In 1956, the French and the British bombed Egypt. That was the so-called Suez Crisis. They bombed it together with the Israeli. So if you remember the UN Charter, which says you're not allowed to bomb another country, okay, that's illegal. It's totally illegal. Then obviously you would expect the UN Security Council to react. But now if you go into the data, and obviously I spent a lot of time reading through the transcripts of the Security Council, because there are official transcripts. Everybody can read them. You will find them on the internet. And the official records show that the French and the British just said, hey, basically, yes, we bombed Egypt, but if you want to pass a resolution, we're going to veto it. So you can't condemn the French and you can't condemn the British in the Security Council because they have the power to veto. Or if you take the US, they tried to overthrow the government in Cuba, Fidel Castro. Okay, that's another example I look at in more detail in my book. In 1961, there was an illegal invasion of Cuba. The Americans, they trained Cubans in Florida and then sent them on a small boat to Cuba and hoped, to have a small guerrilla army which would then overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. Now, this didn't work, okay? Castro won and defeated them. So the Cubans, Cuba is a small country, okay, 10 million people. The Cubans went to the UN Security Council and said, hey, we're being attacked by the United States. This is illegal. You can't do that. We're a small country. Come on. And then the U.S. ambassador in the United Nations, his name at the time was Adlai Stevenson. That was in 1961. He said, gee, we have nothing to do with this. So the Security Council members lie very often. They lie such a lot, They create a whole mess. If they were to speak the truth more often, that would be very helpful for world peace. But Stevenson said, the Cubans, yeah, this is just a brutal dictatorship. And so Fidel Castro's pilot, before leaving the country, bombed their own country and then landed in Florida and escaped the dictatorship. So that was just his fairy tale story. And people believed it. Well, some people didn't, but some people believed it. And what the CIA at the time had done was they had just taken airplanes and painted FAR on that plane, which is Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, which is the name for the Cuban Air Force. They had just painted the name on the CIA planes to confuse everybody. What I'm telling you here is that Cuba then asked for a condemnation of this illegal war of aggression of the United States against Cuba. And what happened? Guess what? The UN didn't work, because the United States put in its veto. So they said, you're not gonna pass a resolution condemning the United States. So the veto powers are like 5 kings, okay? So one king is Russia, one king is China, one king is the US, one king is France, and one king is Great Britain. And these 5 kings, if they carry out wars of aggression, it's very hard to stop them. That's really the problem of the United Nations. But I always, when I work, at conferences or with students or in public talks or in my book, I always say it would be very stupid to say, oh, the UN doesn't work, so let's just, forget about it. That's not a good idea, because the United Nations today is still the best we have. What we should do is we should have mechanisms that come into force even if UN Security Council members with veto powers violate international law. That's very tricky. We don't know yet how to do this. But basically, I think the United Nations are important. We've had, unfortunately, many wars of aggression during the last 70 years. Also now, Trump, who bombed Syria in April 2017, that was illegal. Trump had no resolution of the Security Council. And basically, there's only 2 cases when the war is legal. One is self-defense. Okay, so when a country is attacked, it has the right to defend itself. That's in the Charter. And the second case is if you fight a war and you have an explicit, and I repeat, it has to be an explicit authorization from the UN Security Council. All other wars are illegal. So hopefully the peace movement can in every discourse that we have, bring up the United Nations more and more often, and remind everybody, remind people in the newspaper, remind people in the TV stations that it is illegal to bomb another country. Illegal, totally illegal.